One industry that was experiencing unprecedented growth during the 1950s was manufacturing the component which made the computer possible, the valve. Computers gobbled up valves as fast as the manufacturers could turn them out. But the boom was about to come to an abrupt end. To most people, the transistor meant small portable radios. But the transistor itself was a tiny electronic component, which some call the most important invention of the 20th century. Its inventors, Walter Brattain, John Bardeen and William Shockley, won the Nobel Prize in 1956, in the same year as the first transistorized computer went into production. The valve, or vacuum tube, had been the main switching element in a computer circuit. It was realized that the transistor could play precisely the same role.
The transistor was much, much smaller than a vacuum tube, for example, perhaps a 50th the size. It weighed about 100 times less than a vacuum tube. It gave off no heat. It required a fraction of the electrical power that a vacuum tube needed. What that meant for engineers designing computers is that with transistors, they could now think in terms of designing computers that were much, much more complex and powerful than anybody would have dreamed of designing using vacuum tube technology. But as soon as they did that, you see, they ran into this problem of how do you wire them all together? You had this incredible tangle of wiring.
The Atlas, built at Manchester in 1962, was the ultimate transistorized computer. At the time the most powerful computer in the world, it could handle 1 million instructions every second. Connecting up the thousands of components created a wiring nightmare. This problem, which multiplied as the number of components increased, became known as the tyranny of numbers. Until it was solved, computers more powerful than the Atlas were hard to envisage. And yet a solution to the tyranny of numbers problem was already available. This was one of the earliest integrated circuits, a device that would change the world. The idea was first suggested by Geoffrey Dummer, a British radar engineer in the early 50s. But the scientists at Fairchild Semiconductor in California, and in particular Robert Noyce, produced the first manufacturable integrated circuit, the chip. Essentially, it was made from just one piece of silicon, a material fabricated from common sand. Chemically altering small sections of the silicon made transistors, the cone-shaped structures. Chemically treating other areas of the silicon created other electronic components. Then, to wire everything together in a circuit, a layer of metal was evaporated on top of the structure. The tyranny of numbers problem in principle had been solved. No longer was it necessary to hand wire large numbers of electronic components together. One manufacturing process made the components and wired them together. And as an added bonus, the circuitry of a whole board could now be reduced to the size of a fingernail. The integrated circuit had been announced in 1959, but surprisingly, computer firms showed little interest in this new electronic marvel. For some, the integrated circuit was just too radical a change. But for most, it was just too expensive. Brilliant though the advance was, there seemed to be no takers.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news. All Moscow is waiting to give a hero's welcome to the world's first spaceman, Major Gagarin of the Soviet Air Force. Major Gagarin.
After the Russians' triumph in sending the first man into space, Nothing less than a man on the moon would restore American pride. Yuri Gagarin's epic voyage prompted Kennedy's challenge to his nation's scientists and engineers. It also ensured that the integrated circuit would become a component of computers. If a spacecraft was to land a man on the moon, it would need an onboard computer to maneuver it into orbit. But how could they put a computer into a spacecraft when it could barely hold its 3 astronauts? Transistorized computers, like the Atlas, weighed over 20 tons and contained miles of wire. Extremely sensitive to heat and vibration, they were hardly devices to be put aboard a spaceship. NASA scientists knew a small, lightweight computer could only be built from integrated circuits, and they were willing to pay any price. So was the Pentagon. A Cold War between 2 superpowers demanded weapons of unprecedented sophistication. By the early 1960s, computers made from integrated circuits were needed to guide the Minuteman II missiles, the submarine-launched Polaris missiles, and Air Force jets. Working around the clock, electronic